I found a letter, she said softly. Nathan never finished it. But he was writing to you. He was finally ready to make the first move. Edward's hand trembled around his glass. He wanted his daughters to know their grandfather. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of things never said, years, never shared love, never given a proper chance, and somehow, from the ashes of old wounds, something new had begun to grow. This isn't just a story about loss. It's a story about second chances, about the kind of love that shows up late but still matters, about a man who thought he had lost everything. Until he looked into the eyes of his granddaughters and realized he still had time to get it right. If you believe in the power of healing, the beauty of reconnection, and the quiet strength of family, stay with us. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Shining Stories, where every story finds its way home. Now let's begin. It was still dark when Elena Moore opened her eyes. Not because the night had ended, but because her body no longer knew how to rest. She lay still for a moment, listening to the silence, to the low grumble of the old heater struggling to do its job, to the tiny sighs of her daughters sleeping nearby. Across the room on a makeshift mattress pushed against the wall, Lily and Hazel lay curled up together. Lily had just turned 10. Hazel was 9, quieter, with eyes that always seemed older than her years. Elena sat up slowly, every movement deliberate, careful not to wake them. The cold air bit at her skin as she swung her legs over the edge of the bed and stood wrapping herself in a frayed cardigan that used to belong to her husband. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet as she made her way to the kitchen, more out of habit than hunger. These mornings had become a kind of ritual, moving through them without thinking, because thinking led to fear. She opened the cupboard knowing what she'd find. Half a slice of bread in a plastic bag, the last scoop of peanut butter, a box of pasta that wouldn't last more than one meal. The fridge gave her nothing new. A bruised apple, a carton of milk nearly empty, and some leftover beans she'd stretched across 3 dinners. Elena didn't sigh. She'd run out of sighs weeks ago. Instead, she filled the coffee pot with what little grounds were left. The scent filled the room, warm and comforting, almost enough to disguise the dampness seeping in from the bathroom walls. She leaned against the counter and closed her eyes. It had been more than 2 years since Nathan died. A car crash on a rainy evening, sudden and final. He left behind a guitar in the corner and 2 young daughters who asked fewer questions about him now, but still paused when they passed his photograph on the shelf. Mom. A voice pulled her back. Lily stood in the kitchen doorway, hair-tousled eyes still soft from sleep. "Hey, sweetheart," Elena said, masking the ache in her chest with a smile. "I'm hungry. You came to the right place. Let's get breakfast started." Hazel followed close behind, holding her worn-out stuffed rabbit to her chest. She didn't say anything. She rarely did in the mornings. She just watched. "Can we have pancakes?" Lily asked, with quiet hope. Elena hesitated. There were no eggs, no flour, no milk to spare. "Not today, my love, but I can make toast with peanut butter, and we'll shape them like stars, pancakes on Saturday deal." It was a promise, one she wasn't sure she could keep. But sometimes promises are the only currency a mother has left. The girls sat at the small table, feet dangling above the floor. Elena cut the toast into careful shapes, as if that might make it more filling. She sipped her coffee slowly, not for the taste, but for the warmth it gave her hands. On the wall, the calendar stared back at her, its dates marked with deadlines she was already too late to meet. 3 months of unpaid rent, too many job applications sent and too few replies, and 2 little girls who still believed she could make everything okay. Elena didn't cry. Not here. Not now. Instead, she turned to face the day as she always did. Not because she had the strength, but because she had no choice. The job at the dental clinic had ended quietly without ceremony. One morning, the doors simply didn't open, and by afternoon, The landlord had changed the locks. Since then, Elena had done what she could, a temporary front desk role at a local auto repair shop, odd shifts cleaning offices at night. It was just enough to buy groceries and keep the lights from being shut off, but the rent had slipped further and further behind. And now, it was more than a whisper in her thoughts. It was a storm. Where would they go? Her parents were long gone. Nathan's father had shut the door on his son years before Lily was born. Friends. Some had helped. A grocery card here, a spare coat there, but everyone had their own children, their own bills. She was stirring her coffee again, long gone cold, when the knock came. Not loud, but final. Elena's heart dropped. She stood quickly steadying herself with one hand on the table. The girls looked up, but she gave them a quick nod. Stay here all right. She crossed the room with slow, reluctant steps, opened the door. A man stood there in a sharp charcoal suit holding an envelope, the color of paper left too long in the sun. He didn't smile, didn't blink. Elena Moore. Her voice barely came out. Yes. You are hereby notified that you must vacate this unit within 30 days. The property owner has issued an official eviction. She took the envelope with trembling hands. It felt heavier than it should have, like it contained not just paper but judgment. Is there any way to make arrangements? She asked, hating how fragile her voice sounded. That would be a matter between you and the owner. I'm just the courier. He turned, leaving without another word. The door clicked shut behind her as her knees buckled. She slid down against the frame, pressing the envelope to her chest, like a shield against the weight, crushing her lungs. 30 days. 30 days to find another roof. 30 days to come up with deposits, rent in advance, maybe furniture, maybe hope. Impossible. Mom. The voice was small. Barely a breath. Hazel stood at the kitchen doorway, still in her pajamas, gripping her rabbit. Elena wiped at her eyes and lifted her chin. Everything's fine, sweetheart, just grown-up stuff. But Hazel didn't move. Her gaze stayed on her mother, searching for a truth she couldn't name. A moment later, Lily joined her. The same quiet question written across her face. Did we do something wrong? Lily asked. Elena shook her head quickly and opened her arms. The girls rushed to her like birds to a nest, burying their faces into her shoulders. No, my loves. You did nothing wrong. You are my everything. Everything is all right. She held them tight, breathing in their scent, childhood, safety, trust. Things she wasn't sure she could protect anymore. I promise, she whispered into their hair, I'll find a way. But as they returned to the table and picked at their toast, Elena sat still for a moment longer, the eviction notice now lying face down on the floor. She wasn't sure if this would be the promise she couldn't keep miles away inside a tower of glass and steel. A man named Edward Langford stirred his third cup of espresso and stared at a spreadsheet glowing on his screen. At 65, Edward didn't leave much to chance. He had built his real estate empire from precision, not passion. Numbers mattered, outcomes mattered, emotion. No, your 9 o'clock canceled. Mr. Langford, said Rebecca, his assistant placing a file neatly on his desk, and here are this month's eviction updates. He glanced at it, barely interested. Anything unusual? Mostly standard notices, one from the West End district, a single mother, 2 children. He nodded, unbothered. Children don't change contracts. Follow through. Rebecca lingered. Sir, the tenant's last name is Moore Elena Moore. The name didn't register until she added almost hesitantly, she was connected to Nathan. Edward's hands paused. Nathan, the son he hadn't spoken to in over a decade. The boy who had chosen music over mergers, who had walked away and then vanished entirely. Edward stared out the window. The skyline he had shaped sparkled beneath the morning sun, proud and indifferent. The legacy he had built stood tall, silent, and cold. But now, Now it seemed part of that legacy was being forced out of a home by his own company. Years ago, Nathan Langford had stood in this very office with his fists clenched and his voice breaking, "Not everyone wants your empire, Dad." He had been 24 then, sharp, idealistic, painfully sincere. He had music in his veins and rebellion in his soul, and he wanted nothing to do with boardrooms and balance sheets. Edward had cut him off that same day, not out of cruelty, but calculation. He believed Nathan would return once the world proved him wrong, but Nathan never did, and now Nathan was gone. Edward's gaze drifted out the window until a crackle from the intercom brought him back. "Mr. Langford," came Rebecca's voice, tight with urgency. "There's something you need to see about the eviction case from West End." "Handle it," he replied automatically. "It's the tenant's name," she said. "Elena Moore. But there's another name tied to the lease, Nathan Langford." The silence in the office thickened. Edward didn't speak, didn't blink, but something in his chest shifted. "Bring me the file," he said more quietly than usual. Moments later, Rebecca returned. She laid the folder on his desk and stepped back. Edward opened it slowly, as if afraid of what he might find. There, clipped to the front page, was a photo of a woman, early 30s, tired eyes, a quiet dignity. And beside her, 2 little girls. They had Nathan's eyes. Edward's hand tightened on the edge of the desk. The espresso on his table had gone cold, and his heartbeat, always steady, now stumbled. Nathan had children, he had grandchildren, and they were about to be pushed out of their home by the very machine Edward had built. He stood up. No words, no hesitation. The calendar on his wall was full, but the rest could wait. Within minutes, his black sedan was carving through the city, far from the towers of glass and steel he normally ruled from. He had never visited West End in person, only read its name on quarterly reports. Now it felt like stepping onto another planet. The buildings were chipped, the paint faded, the people moved with the heaviness of trying to stay afloat. He parked outside a narrow brick complex, the number barely visible on the rusted door. "What am I doing here?" he thought. What right did he have to show up like this? But then he remembered they were his blood, and they were about to lose everything. So he adjusted his tie, stepped out of the car, and walked to the door. Inside, Elena sat at the kitchen table, eyes fixed on the screen of her phone. Another rejection. Another missed chance. The eviction notice still lay on the counter unopened since last night. "Mommy, can we go outside?" Lily asked, tugging gently on her sleeve. "Not right now, baby." Elena murmured, her voice thin. Then came the knock, sharp, measured. Elena froze. Not again. She smoothed her hair, took a slow breath, and went to the door. When she opened it, her words caught in her throat. The man standing there was tall, with silver hair and a suit that didn't belong anywhere near these crumbling walls. But it wasn't his clothes that startled her. It was his eyes, Nathan's eyes. "Elena Moore?" he asked. She stared at him. "Edward Langford." She said, her voice cool, not a question, a statement, an accusation. He seemed surprised she knew, "May I come in?" "Why," she said, "to inspect the place before you throw us out." But she moved aside anyway. Edward stepped into the apartment and paused. The space was small, sparse clean despite the wear. He looked around, but said nothing. Then 2 small figures appeared in the hallway. "Who are you?" Lily asked, bold as always. Hazel hung back, holding her bunny. Edward turned, and the world shifted. They had his son's dimples, his son's eyes. He began, then faltered. "Are you the man in Mommy's photo album?" Hazel asked softly. Elena quickly stepped between them. "Girls, go to your room, please." "But now." When they were gone, she turned to face him. "What do you want?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes remained on the hallway where the girls had stood. "They're Nathan's," he said at last. "Yes," Elena replied. "Your granddaughters? The ones you never knew? The ones your company is about to put on the street?" "You never even knew they existed," Elena said quietly, her voice laced with grief more than anger. "Because you erased Nathan the moment he chose a life you didn't approve of." The words landed hard. Edward Langford's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. "I didn't know he had children," he said at last, voice low. "Would it have mattered?" Elena asked. The question was like a blade, sharp, swift, and fair. Silence fell between them. Heavy, unforgiving. Edward looked down at the envelope on her counter, the eviction notice his company had signed off on. "I came to tell you." He cleared his throat as if the words resisted, leaving him. "There's been a mistake!" Elena let out a dry laugh, more bitter than amused. No mistake. We're behind on rent, and your company doesn't make exceptions. You're a businessman. You follow numbers, not names." He looked at her again more intently now. "How did Nathan die?" The question caught her off guard. She blinked, then spoke without thinking. "A car accident just over 2 years ago." For a moment, something flickered across Edward's face. Regret, maybe, or guilt, that had arrived too late. "I want to help," he said, Elena's arms folded across her chest, a wall going up fast. "We don't need your pity." "It's not pity," Edward replied, fumbling with words he rarely used. "It's my responsibility." "No," Elena said firmly. "Your responsibility ended the day you forced Nathan to choose between his dream and his father." From the hallway, a small voice broke through. "Mommy, is that our grandpa?" Both adults turned. Hazel stood there, one hand on the wall, eyes wide and searching. In that moment, the man who had once commanded boardrooms without blinking looked lost. Before Elena could say anything, Lily joined her sister. "You look like Daddy," she said softly, studying Edward's face the way children do, with no filter, no fear. Edward didn't move. For the first time in decades, he didn't know what to say. Elena swallowed the emotion building in her chest. "This is Mr. Langford," she said gently. "He was your father's father." "So he is our grandpa," Lily said, as if declaring a solved mystery. Her eyes lit up in a way Elena hadn't seen in weeks. Hazel stayed half hidden behind her sister but didn't look away. "Why haven't we met you before?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The question, so innocent and so exact, hit harder than anything Elena had said. Edward looked to her wordless. I live very far away," he offered finally the lie. Weak on his tongue, Elena opened her mouth to correct him, but then stopped. It wasn't the time. Edward slowly lowered himself to his knees, bringing himself to the girl's eye level. It was awkward, unnatural, but somehow honest. "I didn't know about you," he said, voice softer than they'd ever heard it. "Your daddy and we didn't speak for a long time." Hazel tilted her head. "Did you have a fight?" Edward nodded slowly. "Yes, a big one." Lily offered a quiet piece of wisdom. "Daddy said it's okay to fight as long as you say sorry after." The room fell still. Edward blinked quickly, and Elena, watching from behind, wasn't sure, but she thought his eyes shimmered. "That's very wise," he whispered. Elena stepped forward, placing a hand on each girl's shoulder. "Why don't you two go build something with your blocks?" she said gently. As the girls returned to their room, Edward stood slowly, carefully, like a man rising from something more than a chair. Elena's expression hardened again. "Let's get one thing clear. Whatever this is, this guilt that hit you the moment you saw them, it doesn't change what happened." "I know," he said quietly. "Do you?" she challenged. "Because Nathan spent years hoping every birthday, every Christmas he checked the mailbox, just in case he wanted to believe you'd remember him, that you'd change your mind." Edward's shoulders straightened, a reflex, a defense. But it didn't work on her. He was the one who walked away, he muttered. Because you gave him no choice. She snapped, her voice rising. Your way or nothing. Elena swallowed the lump in her throat, her voice steady, though her hands had curled into fists. And now you show up, she said, not because you cared, but because you realized your granddaughters are sweet little girls. Edward didn't flinch. I came because I discovered my company was putting them and you out of your home. I didn't know about them, Elena. Had I known. He didn't finish the sentence. The silence said what he couldn't. She folded her arms, skeptical. What exactly do you want, Mr. Langford? He straightened his collar, his voice regaining its polished edge. I'd like to offer you a position at Langford & Co. Administrative. Steady hours, benefits, full salary. She blinked. Why would you do that? It's not charity, he added quickly as if reading her thoughts. It's real work, with real compensation. Before she could answer, a small voice broke the moment. Are you coming back? Hazel, quiet and wide-eyed, had crept to the hallway again, her gaze fixed on Edward like he was a question waiting to be answered. Elena saw something shift in the man's expression, a flicker of warmth, or maybe a fracture in all that control. Yes, he said softly, if your mother is all right with it. That night, after the girls were finally asleep, after she had kissed their foreheads and answered every curious question with carefully worded half-truths, Elena sat alone on the sofa, the business card in her hand. The name printed on it glared under the dim lamp, Edward Langford. He was offering her a job. She had every reason to tear it in half. Nathan had spent his life carrying the wound his father left. Taking a job from the same man felt like betrayal, like folding a life that Nathan had protected into the very world he walked away from. But the notice still sat on the counter. 30 days, the girls deserved more than cardboard boxes and borrowed couches. Her phone rang, unknown number. She answered, Hello, Ms. Moore. This is Edward Langford. She sat up, her voice cool. How did you get this number? I have resources, he said without apology. Have you given thought to my offer? It's been 6 hours. In my experience, people who know what they want don't need long. She sighed, rubbing her temples. Your experience doesn't include single mothers staring down eviction notices. There was a pause. Then, softer than before, he said, Fair point. She hesitated, then asked, Is this a real job or something created for show? It's a real position. You'd report to our administrative director, Daniel Forrester. It's not tied to me. And the company supports family, needs emergencies. School calls. How convenient, she replied, dry. Business evolves, even mine. There was another pause. Then came a question she hadn't expected. I'd like to know more about them. The girls. Her voice changed instantly. Sharper. Guarded. Why? Because they carry Nathan's name. Because now they're part of your legacy. No, he said, but she was already standing pacing the small living room. You don't get to care now. Where were you when he graduated, when we got married, when Lily and Hazel were born? He needed you, and you were silent. I made mistakes, Edward admitted. For once his voice wasn't polished, it was raw. She laughed, not because it was funny, but because it hurt. You didn't make mistakes, you broke him. Silence followed, as if even the air in the room had paused. Do you know, she whispered, he kept your business card in a drawer, just in case one day you'd call. The line went quiet, so quiet she thought he might have hung up. Finally, Edward said, barely audible, I didn't know in him. There's a lot you didn't know, she said, her voice trembling now, like how he worked 3 jobs after the girls were born, or how he turned down a touring offer the kind musicians only dream of because it meant 6 months away from us. She took a breath. That's what a father does. The air between them was tight with unspoken things. Edward finally exhaled, his voice low, almost hoarse. The job offer still stands, he said, but if you choose to walk away, I'll understand. Elena closed her eyes. Pride was loud, but hunger was louder, fear louder still. And through it all, two small faces floated in her mind, Lily's and Hazel's trusting innocent waiting for her to make the world safe again. She opened her eyes and spoke clear but quiet. "I'll take the job." Edward nodded once, but she wasn't finished. "I'm doing it for them, not for you. This doesn't mean you get to step into their lives as if nothing happened." "I understand, do you?" she asked, voice sharp again. "Because let me be clear, if you hurt them even unintentionally, even once, you'll never see them again." The threat hung in the air, cold and final. Edward didn't argue. He simply asked, "When can you start?" "Monday, but I'll need childcare support." "Consider it done. I'll have Rebecca coordinate everything." The call ended, and for a long moment Elena stared at her phone. She didn't know if she had just accepted a lifeline or signed a deal with the very man who had helped break the person she once loved. But either way, there was no turning back. Morning came wrapped in fog as Edward Langford stepped out of his car and walked the path he had avoided for more than 2 years. The cemetery was silent except for the soft chirping of birds and the gravel crunching beneath his polished shoes. He carried a simple bouquet of lilies clutched too tightly in one hand, the stems slightly crushed. He found the grave easily, though he hadn't visited since the funeral. He hadn't spoken to anyone that day, hadn't even introduced himself to the young woman who stood weeping over the coffin, the woman he now knew as Elena. He stood in front of the marble headstone, reading the name aloud in his mind. Nathan Charles Langford, 1990, 2022. Beloved husband and father. The last word struck him hardest. Father Nathan had become something Edward never truly managed to be. He cleared his throat not to speak to anyone around him, but because the moment felt too heavy to stay silent. "I met your daughters yesterday," he said softly. "You should have told me." The stone didn't answer, only stood firm, polished and cold. "They have your eyes," he continued. "Lily has your boldness. Hazel watches everything like your mother once did." He shifted, uncomfortable in his own skin. "I offered Elena a job at the company you couldn't stand, the one you walked away from, because I couldn't understand why anyone would want less than power." The memories hit like waves. Nathan, 25, furious, determined. "There's more to life than making money from someone else's home, Dad." And Edward, cold, unforgiving. "Then do it without me." "I never called you," he whispered. "I assumed life would humble you, that you'd come back." He placed the flowers at the base of the stone, his fingers brushing the cold granite. "But you didn't." He paused. "Did you fail Nathan? Or did you find the kind of happiness I never knew how to give you?" His phone buzzed in his coat pocket. A message from Rebecca Jessica. No, Elena had called the office. She wanted to know the details for her first day. Edward didn't answer immediately. His gaze stayed on the name etched into stone. "She said you kept my card," he murmured. "Was that your olive branch or your way of proving you could survive without me?" There was no reply, only the soft wind brushing through the trees and the weight of things left unsaid. "I don't know how to be a grandfather," Edward admitted. "I barely managed to be a father, but those girls, they didn't ask to inherit all this silence." A groundskeeper passed by, giving him a respectful nod. Edward returned it absently. "I offered her a job and a place to live. She thinks it's guilt." He said, "Maybe it is, or maybe it's the only thing left I can do right." The phone vibrated again, insistently. He finally answered. "Mr. Langford, Rebecca said, Elena Moore called. She's asking about arrangements for Monday." He looked down once more at Nathan's name. "Tell her," he said quietly, "I'll meet her myself." "But sir, you don't normally—" "I do now." He ended the call. And for the first time in decades, Edward Langford didn't walk back to his car like a man in control. He walked like someone trying to catch up to everything he'd missed. As Edward Langford ended the call and slipped back into his car, a strange stillness settled over him. Something inside had shifted, not a full change. Not yet, but perhaps the first thread of unraveling pride. It was too late to be the father Nathan needed. But maybe not too late to become the grandfather Lily and Hazel deserved. Monday morning came with nerves wrapped in determination Elena had spent the whole Sunday preparing. She'd ironed a navy blouse, chosen a pair of black slacks that had seen better days, but still looked respectable, and studied office basics online late into the night. "Do you have to go, Mommy?" Hazel asked softly as Elena braided her hair. "I do, sweetheart," she said gently. "Mommy's starting a new job today. It'll help us keep our home." "With Grandpa." Lily chimed in, already dressed, bouncing on her heels. Elena paused. "At his company, yes. Will we see him today?" Hazel's voice was quieter, laced with hesitation. "I don't know," Elena said honestly, brushing a strand of hair behind Hazel's ear. "But I'll be home in time for dinner. You can tell me all about your day with Mrs. Peterson." She dropped the girls next door, kissed their foreheads twice each, a ritual of luck, then boarded the city bus downtown. The Langford & Co. building stood like a monument in the heart of the business district, 40 stories of mirrored glass and brushed steel. She hesitated at the front steps, suddenly feeling small. Inside, a woman at the reception desk looked up with polished professionalism. "Good morning, may I help you?" "Elena Moore. I'm starting today, administrative team." Recognition sparked in the woman's eyes. "Yes, of course, Mr. Langford is expecting you 15th floor." Elena blinked. "Mr. Langford himself." She had assumed HR would process her, maybe some middle manager, not him. The elevator ride felt longer than 15 floors. Her reflection in the brushed steel walls stared back at her. Calm on the surface, storm underneath. When the doors opened, Rebecca, the same assistant she'd spoken to by phone, greeted her with a polite nod. "This way, please. Mr. Langford would like to introduce you personally." They walked through a sleek open workspace. Heads turned, murmurs passed. Elena kept her eyes forward, heart thudding. Edward stood at the far end of the floor, speaking quietly with a man in glasses and a gentle expression. He looked up as she approached. "Ms. Moore," he said, voice neutral, formal. "This is Daniel Forrester, our administrative manager. You'll report directly to him." Daniel extended a hand with a warm smile. "Welcome aboard, Elena." She took it tense. "Rebecca briefed me on your background," he added quickly. "Single mom re-entering the corporate world. That's it, nothing else." Edward cleared his throat. "Daniel will oversee your onboarding. If you need anything urgent, Rebecca knows how to reach me." Elena's voice was cool. "I'm sure I'll manage." As Edward turned to leave, she hesitated, then added quieter than before. "Thank you. For the opportunity." He paused. Something flickered in his expression, not quite a smile, but softer than anything she'd seen from him. "I know you won't waste it." Daniel led her to a modest workstation tucked near the windows. The morning passed in a blur of login credentials, orientation forms, unfamiliar systems, and polite but curious glances. By noon, Elena's head throbbed, her fingers ached from note-taking. "How's it going?" Daniel asked, setting a file down beside her. "It's a lot," she admitted, rubbing the bridge of her nose. "Everyone feels that way on day one. You're doing fine. Really." In the break room, she unwrapped her sandwich and tried not to feel out of place. Across the table, a woman slid into the seat beside her with a knowing smile. "You're the one who came in with Mr. Langford this morning." Elena looked up, startled. "It wasn't a big deal." The woman chuckled. "If he walks you in himself, it's a big deal. I'm Alicia, by the way." At first, Elena hesitated, but sometimes the simplest truth was the safest one. "He knew my husband," she said softly. Alicia gave a gentle nod, not pushing further, and for that, Elena was quietly grateful. By the end of her first day, Elena's legs ached and her head spun with names, systems, and processes that all blurred together. She had just slung her bag over her shoulder when Daniel appeared beside her desk. "You did well today," he said. "See you tomorrow." "I'll be here," Elena replied, more relieved than confident. Outside the building, she paused, surprised to see Edward Langford waiting beside a sleek black sedan, hands in his pockets. "I thought you might want a ride," he said, as if it were the most casual offer in the world. First days are exhausting. Elena wanted to refuse, wanted to cling to the last shred of independence, but her feet, her fatigue, and her reality overruled pride. "Thank you." The city slipped past in streaks of light and shadow as they drove. "How was it?" Edward asked after a moment. "Different, challenging," she answered honestly. "But I'll learn." He gave a small nod, eyes fixed on the road. "Daniel says you're picking things up fast." "He's kind," she said. It was the safest response. They rode in silence for a while, the car humming softly beneath them. Then his voice again. "The girls, are they doing well?" Elena studied his face in profile, searching for performance, for pretense. She found none. "They're curious about you," she admitted. "They've never had a grandfather before." His posture shifted barely. But she noticed, "I've never been one before." He said quietly, "It wasn't an apology, not yet, but it was something." As they pulled up in front of her apartment, Elena glanced sideways, and she realized this, whatever it was, might be the beginning of something neither of them could define yet. The weeks that followed passed in a blur of routine and effort. Every morning began with calculated chaos, feeding and dressing, Lily and Hazel getting them to Mrs. Peterson's, and catching the 7:15 bus into the city. The towering Langford building no longer felt so intimidating. Familiar paths formed from the elevator to her desk, from the break room to the copier. Daniel remained steady and patient, never patronizing. "You're picking this up faster than most," he said one afternoon, after Elena had processed a particularly complicated batch of property files. "Necessity teaches fast," she replied with a small smile. Her co-workers, once curious about the woman who had arrived under the wing of Edward Langford himself, slowly came to accept her as part of the team. Only Alicia, during lunch breaks, would sometimes lean a little closer. "So, your husband, did he work with Mr. Langford?" Elena answered carefully. "They knew each other a long time ago. We reconnected recently." It was true, though, far from the whole story. At work, Edward remained distant, professional. Their conversations were brief, clipped, sometimes no more than a nod in the hallway, but every evening his car waited outside. At first the rides were silent, tense. But over time, they softened, filled with quiet exchanges about childcare schedules, grocery prices, work updates. Still, Nathan's name was never spoken, but his absence hovered like a third presence between them. One evening, just before they reached her building, Elena spoke. "Hazel asked about you yesterday." Edward's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. "What did she say?" "She wanted to know if you like music, like her dad did." The car slowed as he turned the corner. "What did you tell her?" "That I didn't know," Elena said. Then she looked at him. "Do you—" He was quiet for a while. Then Nathan got that from his mother. "I never connected with it." Elena smiled, faintly surprised by her own memory. "He used to play guitar for the girls before they were born. Said they danced in my belly when he played." Edward cleared his throat, shifting in his seat. "They seem to be handling your new schedule well," he said. "The subject change was clumsy, but Elena let it happen. Mostly. There was a meltdown yesterday because I missed bedtime stories. Mrs. Peterson is kind, but she's not me." They pulled up outside the building. For a long moment, neither moved. "Thank you for the ride," Elena said quietly. Edward nodded, and though nothing more was spoken, something in the air between them had changed, softer now and harder to ignore. "I could arrange something more suitable," Edward offered as they pulled into her block, a professional nanny, someone qualified. I'm managing just fine, Elena said, her tone firmer than intended. I don't need more help than I already agreed to, especially not as charity. Edward frowned. It's not charity to insure your children. My grandchildren are well cared for. They are well cared for, she replied, sharper now. I've been doing this on my own since Nathan passed. Honestly, since before that. Her words hovered in the silence between them, and they both understood what she hadn't said out loud. Nathan had been raising them alone too in ways Edward never saw. When they pulled up in front of her apartment, Edward cleared his throat. There's another matter I wanted to bring up, your lease. Elena's posture stiffened. I still have 3 weeks before the eviction date. I've reviewed your housing situation. He continued, his tone slipping back into the businessman's rhythm. This building isn't safe. The front lock barely works. Maintenance is unreliable. It's what I can afford, she replied. Defensive. I have an apartment in Ridgewood Heights, 2 bedrooms, gated building walking distance to a good school. It's vacant. She turned to look at him. Ridgewood Heights. I couldn't even dream of affording the rent there. The rent would match your current income, he said, cutting her off. This would be a business arrangement, not a handout. Elena narrowed her eyes. Why are you really doing this? For once, Edward didn't have a ready answer. He looked out the window, his jaw set, then finally said, Because they deserve better, and so do you. She stared at him. Before she could respond, he added, There's no pressure, just think about it. Elena reached for the door handle, then paused. The girls have a school presentation on Friday morning. They've been practicing for weeks. She hesitated, unsure if she was foolish for saying it. They'd probably be happy if you came. For the first time, a flicker of something passed through his expression. Surprise, maybe, or something harder to name. Text me the details, he said simply. Elena nodded and stepped out. She stood for a moment, watching the black sedan disappear into the traffic, and with each passing day, the hard lines she had drawn between them began to blur. She wasn't ready to forgive Edward Langford. But for her daughter's sake, she was beginning to wonder if maybe someday she could learn to accept him. Friday morning was a disaster in slow motion. Lily woke with a low-grade fever. Hazel spilled juice down the front of her carefully chosen outfit. Elena's alarm didn't go off. Everything unraveled in slow, chaotic detail. By the time they rushed into the school auditorium, Elena was breathless and overwhelmed. We're not late, are we? She whispered to Mrs. Peterson, who had graciously offered to drive, just in time. The older woman reassured her. Kindergarten goes last. Elena scanned the rows of folding chairs, part of her against better judgment, hoping to see Edward. She didn't know why he hadn't promised. She told herself not to expect it. Elena! She jumped slightly at the voice behind her. Edward stood there out of place in a sharply tailored suit, a small bouquet of daisies in his hand. He looked almost uncertain. You came, she said, unable to hide her surprise. You invited me? He replied simply, as if it were that obvious. They took seats near the back, just as the music began to play. Edward sat stiffly as though unsure how to fit into a world of crayons and crepe paper. On stage, the children filed in, blinking under the bright lights, scanning the crowd for familiar faces. Hazel spotted them first, nudging her sister. Despite her flushed cheeks, Lily managed a small, delighted smile. The one on the left isn't feeling well, Elena whispered. Lily. She insisted on coming anyway. Edward's eyes stayed fixed on them. They're stubborn, like Nathan. It was the first time he had mentioned his son unprompted. Elena felt the weight of the moment settle gently between them. Not painful, but present. The lights dimmed, the music swelled, and together they watched the girls step into the spotlight. The kindergartners sang a cheerful tune about the seasons, their small voices rising and falling with practiced hand gestures. By the final verse, Lily was visibly fading. Her cheeks flushed, her movements sluggish. Before the applause even began, Elena was already standing. She needs to go home. She shouldn't be at school today. Beside her, Edward rose without hesitation. My car's closer than the bus. For once, Elena didn't argue. 20 minutes later, they were back at the apartment, Lily curled up on the sofa, a blanket around her shoulders, eyes half-lidded, as a soft cartoon played on the screen. Edward stood uncertainly in the modest living room, as if unsure where to place his hands or himself. Elena led Hazel to the bedroom to help her change out of her juice-stained clothes. When she returned, she found Hazel standing in front of Edward. "Will you stay with us, Grandpa?" Hazel asked, her gaze, sincere and hauntingly familiar. Nathan's eyes all over again. Edward glanced at Elena, silently seeking permission. "Mr. Langford has work," Elena began. "Actually," Edward interrupted, glancing at his watch. "I cleared my morning schedule." Elena raised an eyebrow, surprised, but she said nothing. While she settled Lily with medicine and juice, Edward took a cautious seat on the floor beside Hazel, who had pulled out a worn coloring book and a box of crayons. "Do you like to color, Grandpa?" Hazel asked, offering him a green crayon. Edward studied the crayon like it was a foreign object. "I haven't colored in a very long time." "You stay in the lines better than Mommy," Hazel remarked seriously, leaning over his shoulder as he attempted to fill in a cartoon dinosaur. From the kitchen doorway, Elena paused. There he was, Edward Langford, once a man of concrete contracts and corner offices, now hunched over a coloring book, his tie slightly askew, shading a lopsided tail, while Hazel chatted without pause. There was something vulnerable in his quiet focus. Something human. Her phone rang. She stepped into the kitchen to answer. It was Daniel. "Jessica, sorry, Elena, is everything all right?" he asked. "Mr. Langford canceled all his meetings this morning without explanation. Lily wasn't feeling well," she replied. "He drove us home from the school performance." A pause. "I see. Should I move his afternoon schedule too?" Elena peeked into the living room. Lily, blanket-wrapped, had migrated to the couch beside Edward. Hazel was showing him how to read in different voices. Lily giggled softly at his awkward attempts, and Edward, his face was unguarded, his usual severity replaced by something far gentler. She hesitated. "I'll have him call you back," she said, and ended the call. Some walls, she was starting to realize, weren't meant to stay up forever. The apartment was quiet when Elena returned later that week to see the unit Edward had offered. Sunlight spilled through clean windows onto hardwood floors. The space wasn't large, 2 bedrooms, a cozy living area, and a kitchen with real counter space, but compared to their current place, it felt like stepping into possibility. She ran her hand along the smooth surface of the kitchen counter. "This is really within my salary range," Edward nodded. He stood near the doorway, his posture formal, hands behind his back. "The rent will be tied to your income, proportionate and consistent." He gestured toward a folder on the counter. Elena opened it, flipping through the lease papers, expecting the catch. The clause, the power play disguised as generosity, but the numbers were fair, the terms clear. "Why?" she asked, looking up. His expression didn't change. "Because living conditions affect performance. It's a business decision." She studied him. "Is that all it is?" For a moment, something flickered in his gaze. Not quite guilt, not quite pride, maybe just the discomfort of being seen too clearly. "The girls deserve better than your current building." Elena closed the folder. "And if I fall behind on rent, would you evict us as quickly as your company nearly did before?" Edward didn't flinch. "You won't fall behind." It wasn't exactly an answer, but the quiet confidence in Edward's voice, not in contracts or policy, but in her, caught Elena off guard. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed. Mrs. Peterson had texted, "Girls are asking when you'll be home." "Lily's feeling better." Elena looked up. "I should go," she said, sliding the folder with the lease into her bag. I'll look through this tonight. Take your time, Edward replied. But they both knew her mind was already made up. The following weekend brought moving day, a modest, dusty, hopeful affair. There weren't many boxes, not many things, just years of careful survival now packed tightly and ready for something better. Daniel had arranged for a company van and had even recruited 2 kind maintenance staff to help. Edward, true to form, arrived mid-morning, standing near the curb, watching, not lifting his presence, still striking even in a simple overcoat. It was Lily who spotted him first. "Grandpa!" She squealed, running across the lot. Hazel followed slower, her steps, small but sure. Edward froze for a second before lowering himself to their level. "Hello, girls," he said, voice softer than usual. "Are you excited about your new home? Will our room have pink walls?" Lily asked, eyes wide. "The walls are white," Edward replied, glancing at Elena. "But maybe we can add some color with art and curtains. I'm sure Mr. Langford isn't responsible for interior design," Elena interjected, approaching with a box in her arms. "Actually," Edward cleared his throat, almost sheepish, "I had a few essentials delivered ahead of time. The girls' room has beds and a few decorative items." "Decorative items," Elena repeated, arching an eyebrow. "Nothing extravagant," he added quickly. She soon discovered that Edward's definition of essentials included full bedroom sets for the twins, a living room sofa, a dining table, kitchenware, and even a desk for her in the corner of the living space. The twins' room glowed with soft touches, butterfly decals on one wall, stars and moons on the other. "Edward." Elena began, unsure whether to scold or thank him. "It's not charity," he said quietly. "Call it an advance on future performance bonuses." And then came the sounds that ended all protest, twin squeals of joy. Hazel ran her hand reverently over the lilac comforter. Lily jumped onto her new bed with uncontainable delight. "We have our own beds." Hazel gasped, "No more sharing." Elena felt her throat tighten. The joy in their voices over something so ordinary, something most families took for granted, hit her harder than she expected. Edward stood in the doorway, hands behind his back, watching with an unreadable expression. When Hazel suddenly darted forward and hugged his legs, he stiffened, then hesitantly patted her head. "Thank you, Grandpa," she whispered with sincerity. Edward cleared his throat. "Yes, well, every child needs a proper bed." That evening, when the girls had finally drifted off to sleep in their new room, Elena stepped out onto the small balcony. The night air was warm. A breeze rustled through the trees below. She sat at the outdoor table, a stack of papers before her, the lease, the updated employment agreement, a handful of forms tying her life ever more tightly to Edward Langford. 6 weeks ago, he had been nothing more than a name, Nathan's estranged father. The man Nathan had spent years trying to live without. Now he was her landlord, her employer, and the grandfather her daughters were slowly, earnestly letting into their hearts. She signed the final page, her pen hesitating only briefly. Whatever his reasons, guilt, obligation, or something more complicated, she couldn't deny that her daughters were better off with him in the picture. For their sake, she was learning to live with the contradictions of who he was. 3 months into her job, Elena found herself staying late. The office was quiet. Most desks had long been abandoned, save for a few lights, still glowing in the far corners. The cleaning crew moved like gentle ghosts in the background. She was hunched over a property report when a familiar voice broke the silence. "You're still here." The sound of keys jingling made Elena glance up from her screen. To her surprise, Daniel stood nearby, already in his coat, ready to head home. "Still here?" he asked, eyebrows raised. "Just finishing the West Side portfolio analysis," she said. "I noticed something odd with the occupancy rates." Daniel leaned in, peering over her shoulder as she scrolled through a color-coded spreadsheet. His brows lifted further as patterns began to emerge. "You caught this across all the properties?" Elena nodded. It didn't make sense that the vacancy rate spiked in the same month across different neighborhoods. So I dug a little deeper, cross-referenced with maintenance logs. Turns out every single building had plumbing issues that month. Leaks, water, shut-offs, even mold. Tenants didn't stick around. Daniel blinked. Elena, this is sharp work. Most people in your position wouldn't even think to check. She shifted in her chair, slightly uncomfortable under the weight of praise. I just thought about it like a tenant. When our old place had plumbing issues, everyone talked about moving. And that is exactly the kind of perspective we need more of, Daniel said with a genuine smile. You've got an instinct for this, a natural eye. Elena saved the file and shut her laptop, hoping he wouldn't see how much his words meant. For years, she'd seen herself as a survivor, just a widow, just a mother, just making ends meet. The idea that she might have value, that her mind could bring something meaningful to a room full of professionals felt foreign, but thrilling. I should get home to the girls, she said, reaching for her bag. Edward left about an hour ago. Daniel noted. Want a lift? I'll take the bus, Elena replied with a soft smile. It's close to the new place. The apartment had transformed their lives in quiet, significant ways. The twins were thriving no more, nights interrupted by nightmares, no more flinching at creaking pipes or shouting neighbors. Now there were sleepovers with kids from the building and laughter echoing from the courtyard playground. When Elena arrived home that evening, Mrs. Peterson was in the girls' bedroom reading aloud from a worn storybook. They've been angels, she whispered. Homework's done too before TV time. After the kind neighbor left, Elena tucked Lily and Hazel into their separate beds, a luxury that still hadn't lost its wonder. Tommy from 4B showed us how to make paper airplanes, Lily announced proudly, and mine flew all the way across the playground, Hazel added. Elena smiled and kissed their foreheads. That's amazing. Sweet dreams, my loves. Later, as she folded laundry and prepared for bed, her phone buzzed. A text. Unknown number. Daniel mentioned your analysis of the West Side properties. Would you be willing to present your findings at tomorrow's management meeting? E. Langford. Elena stared at the screen. Edward had never contacted her directly before. She was just an entry-level hire. A management meeting. Her heart thudded. She stared at the message a moment longer, then typed a single word. Yes. The next morning, Elena arrived early, clutching her notes. The large conference room filled gradually with sharp suits and brisk conversation. Executives filed in one by one, settling into high-backed chairs. Edward was the last to enter, composed as ever. He gave her a small, barely perceptible nod before sitting at the head of the table. Before we begin our regular agenda, he said, Ms. Moore has identified an important pattern across multiple West Side properties. I believe it deserves our immediate attention. Every head turned toward her. For one breathless second, Elena froze. Then she remembered. This wasn't the hardest thing she'd faced. She had buried a husband, given birth to twins, survived nights when she didn't know how to keep a roof over their heads. This was just a meeting. Her voice trembled on the first few words, but quickly steadied. She walked the room through her analysis, the data, the cross-referenced reports, the tenant trends. They listened, really listened. Questions followed sharp ones, but she answered them all, not perfectly, but honestly, clearly, confidently. And when the meeting ended, Elena Moore didn't feel like someone surviving anymore. She felt like a woman building something. When Elena finished presenting, the room fell into a thoughtful quiet. Then Edward Langford gave the slightest of nods. Thank you, Ms. Moore. Daniel, coordinate with maintenance. These issues need to be addressed immediately. It wasn't extravagant praise, but coming from Edward, it might as well have been a standing ovation. As the meeting adjourned, Elena was gathering her notes when Edward approached her directly. Good work, he said simply. You have an instinct for this business. Coming from him, those words held unexpected weight. Not just because he was her boss or Nathan's father, but because for once, She saw that he meant it. She realized something. Then, for the first time since Nathan passed, she wasn't just surviving anymore, she was beginning to grow. "Mommy, can Grandpa come to our birthday party?" Lily's question caught Elena off guard as she gently ran a brush through her daughter's hair one quiet Saturday morning. "Birthday party?" she asked, stalling. "Your birthday's still 2 months away." Hazel, seated at the kitchen table with colored pencils scattered around her drawing pad, looked up. "But Ms. Wilson says real parties take planning." Elena smiled at her daughter's serious tone. Their teacher was known for her structured classroom and love of long-term project boards. "Well, we'll see," Elena said gently. "Grandpa's a very busy man. But he's the boss." Lily argued with innocent logic. "Can't he just tell people he has important grandpa things to do?" Elena chuckled. The girls had grown noticeably closer to Edward over the past few months. What began as tentative visits had blossomed into something more regular: weekend lunches, school events, quiet afternoons spent at the park. Just last month, he'd even attended Hazel's school assembly, sitting awkwardly among the other parents in a blazer that looked too formal for folding chairs and juice boxes. But when Hazel's name was called for a reading award, pride had softened the edges of his posture. Her phone buzzed. "Would Saturday lunch be convenient? There's a matter I'd like to discuss. E.L." Even his texts were formal. Elena replied, "The girls are free, noon works." His response was nearly immediate. "I'll pick you up at 12. When Elena shared the news, the girls reacted like they'd won a sweepstakes, dashing to their room, pulling out dresses, holding debates about hairstyles and dessert menus. At exactly 12, Edward's car pulled up outside the apartment. He stepped out to open the doors himself, dressed more casually than usual. No tie, just a crisp shirt and relaxed slacks. "Good afternoon," he greeted, offering a small smile. "Where are we going, Grandpa?" Hazel asked as she climbed in. "I thought we might try Harrison's," Edward said, glancing at Elena. "They have a nice garden area." Elena nodded, a little surprised. Harrison's was elegant, but not pretentious, a place that balanced his usual standards with child-friendly charm. The restaurant's courtyard was shaded by flowering trellises and the soft chatter of other families. The girls were immediately captivated by the illustrated menu, pointing out everything from animal-shaped pancakes to rainbow ice cream. Edward waited for the server to walk away before clearing his throat gently. "There's something I'd like to talk about." He set his eyes meeting Elena's, but his gaze included the girls too. Elena's shoulders tensed. She set her water glass down. "What is it?" "I recently purchased a small lake house. It's about an hour outside the city. Nothing extravagant, just a dock, a bit of a beach." He hesitated, then continued. "I thought perhaps you and the girls might like to spend a weekend there. The summer heat in the city can be unpleasant." Elena blinked, startled. This wasn't about work, not a favor wrapped in a business envelope. This was something personal, an invitation, a gesture, a beach. Lily whispered, her eyes wide. "There's a shallow area for swimming," Edward said, his voice warm, "and kayaks," he added almost shyly. Hazel tilted her head thoughtfully. "Can we stay overnight, like camping? There are proper beds." Edward assured her, 3 bedrooms, actually. Elena narrowed her eyes slightly, studying him. "When did you buy this lake house?" Edward didn't flinch. 2 weeks ago." The implication hung between them like morning mist. He hadn't bought it for himself. He'd bought it for them. Elena felt that old resistance stir inside her, a silent protest shaped by years of hurt. This was the man who had pushed Nathan away, who hadn't shown up when they needed him, who had let too many years pass in silence. And yet... She watched as Edward leaned over the table, showing Lily and Hazel pictures of the lake house on his phone. He answered every one of their rapid-fire questions with surprising patience. There was no performance in his face, just something simple, something sincere. He was trying. Not perfectly, not always smoothly, but genuinely. "We'd have to check our calendar," Elena said at last, setting down her fork. "The girls have swimming lessons on Saturdays." Edward nodded, understanding the meaning beneath her words. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no, either. "The invitation's open," he said, "whenever it works for you." As lunch continued, Elena found herself watching Edward more closely. His posture had softened with time. The sharpness in his gestures had dulled into something steadier. No sudden hugs, no over-the-top praise, but when the girls told stories, he listened with real interest. When Hazel mentioned a boy at school who pushed her off the slide, his eyes darkened with concern. And when the check came, Elena found herself saying, "Maybe next weekend, if the offer still stands." Edward didn't smile in the traditional sense, but something lit behind his eyes. A flicker of hope. "It does," he said quietly. The lake house sat on a gentle slope, its cedar siding faded by sun and wind, nestled among tall pines. A wooden dock stretched into a crystal blue lake, its surface calm and glassy in the afternoon light. It wasn't the grand estate Elena had pictured, no sprawling decks, no glistening marble. It was cozy, thoughtful quiet. "It's beautiful." Lily squealed from the back seat, pressing her hands to the window. The moment the car came to a stop, both girls bolted toward the dock, Shu's forgotten arms flailing with joy. "Stay where I can see you." Elena called instinctively. "They'll be all right," Edward said, lifting a duffel from the trunk. "The water's shallow near the edge and the yard is fully fenced." Elena nodded, though her mother's mind remained on high alert. "This place," she said, looking around, "isn't what I expected." "What did you expect?" he asked, handing her a tote bag. "Something shinier, more Langford-esque." A quiet chuckle escaped him. Nathan used to say I had no appreciation for subtlety. The mention of his son, so unforced, so gentle, caught Elena by surprise. Edward rarely spoke Nathan's name, and never without tension. Inside the house felt lived in and loved. Overstuffed couches, worn wood furniture, a stone fireplace, and picture windows looking out onto the water. Edward set their bags down near the entryway. The couple who owned it were moving to Arizona. It didn't need much work. Elena wandered to the window. Outside, Lily and Hazel were trying to skip stones, laughter echoing across the yard. She didn't turn when she asked, "Why did you really buy this place?" Edward joined her at the window. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, "I never brought Nathan to places like this. His mother wanted to somewhere quiet away from everything. But I was always too busy. Always chasing another deal, another title, another acquisition." He looked down at his hands. "I thought, maybe I could do better this time." There was no grand speech in his voice, no apology dressed in eloquence, just a quiet truth, raw and late but honest, and something in Elena's chest, something she hadn't even known she'd been holding, eased. The weekend unfolded with unexpected ease. Edward had prepared meticulously a quiet kind of care that revealed itself in small but undeniable ways. Child-sized life jackets hung neatly in the boathouse. The fridge was filled with simple, comforting meals, sandwiches, fruit juice boxes, and in the living room a cabinet brimmed with board games still wrapped in plastic. By Saturday evening, after a day spent swimming, collecting rocks, and spotting turtles, Lily and Hazel were barely keeping their eyes open. Elena tucked them into their beds in the cozy room Edward had quietly claimed as theirs, the nautical-themed comforters, the framed prints of lighthouses, the star-shaped nightlight. "Best day ever." Lily murmured, half asleep. "Grandpa showed me a turtle," Hazel added, already drifting off. When Elena returned to the porch, she found Edward sitting in a wooden chair, a half-full glass of whiskey in his hand, his gaze fixed on the moon's reflection across the water. She joined him. He poured her a glass of wine and passed it over without a word. "They're happy," she said simply. Edward nodded. They're remarkable children. They get it from Nathan, she replied. Her voice softened. He would have loved this place. He always talked about teaching them to fish. Edward didn't speak for a moment. When he did, his voice was quiet. He went fishing once with my father, just once he was 10. They didn't catch a thing, but Nathan talked about it for weeks. Elena turned to look at him, studying the lines in his face. You never talk about your father. No. Edward agreed. A long pause passed, then almost reluctantly, it's hard, because you regret how things ended. His jaw tightened, then relaxed. Because I was wrong. The words seemed to cost him something. He chose a different life. I should have respected that. Elena sipped her wine, surprised by the rawness in his voice. Why didn't you? Edward stared into the dark liquid in his glass. Pride, stubbornness, and maybe fear. Fear. He nodded. That he was right. That there really was more to life than everything I built. That I missed it. And he found it. The admission was like a stone dropped into still water. Quiet, but deeply felt. Elena hesitated, then said, After he died, I found a letter he had started writing to you. He never finished it. Edward turned to her, startled. A letter. She nodded. He wanted to reconnect. Not for himself, for the girls. He thought they deserved to know their grandfather. Edward slowly set down his glass. His hands weren't steady. I didn't know. The accident happened before he could finish it. She looked out toward the lake, remembering, he always hoped you'd reach out first, but he was finally ready to try. Silence fell again, not heavy, but full. Shared grief, missed chances. What do you think he'd say about all this? Edward asked quietly. About me being here. Elena turned toward him, meeting his eyes. I think he'd be cautiously hopeful Nathan never stopped loving you, even at his angriest. Edward absorbed her words slowly, as if afraid they'd dissolve if he moved too quickly. His expression, usually so carefully guarded, cracked just enough for her to see something real. Thank you, he said, voice low, for letting me be part of their lives. I know it hasn't been easy. It hasn't, she admitted, but when I see how they look at you, how they light up when you arrive, I think Nathan would have wanted that. As the night deepened around the lake house, something shifted between them, not full forgiveness, but understanding. A shared loss. A shared love. Of the man they had both lost differently, and the two little girls who carried pieces of him in every smile and story. Keep your hands steady, Edward called, jogging alongside Hazel's wobbling bicycle. His sleeves were rolled to his elbows, a trace of sweat on his brow. The sharp lines of the businessman were gone, replaced by a grandfather's breathless joy. Behind them, Elena laughed not at the wobbling bike, but at the sight of Edward Langford, real estate titan, running after a purple bicycle with tassels and training wheels, shouting encouragement like it was the most important meeting of his day. Because maybe for once, it was. From the courtyard bench, Elena watched the scene unfold with quiet disbelief. Edward Langford, once the embodiment of cold ambition and corporate detachment, was now jogging behind her daughter's bicycle on a sleepy Sunday afternoon. Arms, outstretched eyes focused a soft grin on his face. It wasn't just the moment that surprised her. It was the bicycles, shiny, brand new, and clearly not the budget-friendly kind. He had shown up an hour ago, 2 bikes in tow, and declared every child should know how to ride. Look, Mommy, I'm doing it. Hazel shouted as she pedaled a few wobbly feet on her own before Edward caught her just in time. You're a natural, he said, steadying her gently. His hand hovered behind her back, never quite touching, but never far. Nearby, Lily bounced with anticipation. My turn next, Grandpa? Elena chuckled, shaking her head as Edward approached her during a water break. These bikes must have cost a fortune, she said quietly. He shrugged. Every child should have a bicycle. It had become something of a refrain for him. Every child should have proper beds. Every child should have warm winter boots. Every child should have crayons, paints, a place to draw. Each statement, simple on the surface, felt like an echo, not of the things Nathan had gone without materially, but of what he had lacked emotionally. Presence, encouragement, time. You know, Elena said softly, you don't have to buy their affection. Edward blinked momentarily, caught off guard. I wasn't trying to. I know, she interrupted gently, but you already have it. Just being here, that's what matters. He looked back at the twins, now taking turns on the sidewalk, laughing loudly. I missed so much with Nathan. He murmured, first steps, first words. I handed them all off to nannies, to staff, while I chased meetings and acquisitions. You're here now, Elena said simply. Things had changed since that weekend at the lake house 2 months ago. Edward now joined them nearly every Sunday. The girls had even visited his office a few times, proudly parading through the marble halls with juice boxes in hand. Surprisingly, even Elena's co-workers had adapted. Maxwell Langford, real estate icon, trailed by 2 giggling girls, was no longer headline-worthy, just familiar. As if reading her thoughts, Edward turned to her again. Daniel mentioned you're being considered for the assistant property manager position. Elena nodded. He brought it up last week. It would be a step up, more responsibility, and better pay. Edward added, you've earned it. Your reviews have been outstanding. She hesitated. It's not because of us. He raised an eyebrow. Quite the opposite. I specifically told Daniel to evaluate you like anyone else. This promotion, if you accept it, will be based on merit, only merit. Before she could reply, Lily called out again, Grandpa, watch me. Edward excused himself, returning to his post at the sidewalk. Arms outstretched once more, Elena watched him go, a quiet warmth blooming in her chest. 6 months ago, she was barely holding everything together. Facing eviction, choosing between rent and groceries, alone in every way that counted. Now she had stable housing, a job with promise, and most unexpectedly, the beginnings of a support system. That evening, after Edward had said goodbye, and the twins had collapsed into bed with dreams of bicycles and lake turtles, Elena sat alone on the couch scrolling through old photos on her phone. There he was, Nathan, his smile lopsided, his eyes full of something bright and unfinished. You should see your dad, she whispered, tracing his face with her finger. He's trying so hard. Her phone chimed. A text from Edward. The girls did well today. Hazel has natural balance. Lily has determination. Thank you for the afternoon. His messages had changed over time, still measured, still composed, but now warmer. Less armored, Elena replied. They're already planning next Sunday. You've created monsters. The response came quickly. I look forward to it. She smiled and set the phone down, a quiet realization settling over her, somewhere between reluctant tolerance and polite cooperation. She had begun to genuinely appreciate his presence, not for what he gave, but for who he was becoming, a man who showed up, who listened, who tried. Nathan would never witness it, but Elena saw it. And for now, that was enough. The change in Edward was quiet, but undeniable. He wasn't the same man who once stood behind polished glass walls and signed off on evictions without a second thought. He still wore tailored suits, still kept his calendar tight, but beneath all that, something had softened. He hadn't rewritten the past, but he was building something from it, and perhaps that in its own way was healing. Exactly 1 year to the day since the eviction notice had arrived, Elena stood in the kitchen of their apartment smoothing the final layer of frosting on a homemade birthday cake. The twins would turn 7 tomorrow. Their excitement had been growing for weeks. Do you think Grandpa will like our party? Hazel asked carefully, lining up colorful plastic forks on the table. I'm sure he will. Elena smiled, still amused by the image of Edward Langford surrounded by second graders high on sugar and balloons. Over the past months, he had become something solid in their lives, consistent, dependable. He wasn't perfect, but he was present, and for two little girls who once cried themselves to sleep, that mattered more than anything. The doorbell rang. Lily sprinted to open it. "Grandpa's here." Edward stepped inside, holding a large wrapped box in one arm and a smaller package in the other. "Happy early birthday," he greeted as the girls rushed him, arms flung around his waist. "What is it? What did you bring us?" Lily asked, her eyes already locked on the gifts. "You'll have to wait until tomorrow to find out," Edward said, setting the boxes aside with a smile. But Elena noticed something else. A flicker of unease in his posture. He was composed, yes, but beneath the surface, there was something unsettled. "Everything all right?" she asked quietly while the girls returned to decorating. He nodded, then cleared his throat. "There's something I'd like to speak with you about before tomorrow." They stepped out onto the balcony, the cool air brushing past them, the sliding door left slightly open so they could still hear the girls' laughter inside. "What's on your mind?" Elena asked gently. Edward looked out over the skyline, his voice low. "I've been thinking about Nathan lately. He always made birthdays special. He loved to celebrate." Elena nodded, memories rising like smoke. Even for the tiniest things, he once threw a party because the twins finally learned how to tie their shoes. Edward's mouth twitched. That sounds like him. Then after a pause, "I brought something for them. I'm not sure if it's appropriate." It was rare, almost unheard of, to see him hesitate like this, to seek her approval. "What is it?" she asked. He glanced toward the wrapped box. "Nathan's guitar. I found it in storage. Had it cleaned up, restored." Elena's breath caught. "That's what's in the big box." He nodded. "I thought maybe, if they wanted to learn, it would be a way to connect with him." She swallowed hard, overwhelmed by the quiet beauty of the gesture. They'll treasure it, truly. Edward seemed relieved. Then, as if remembering, he offered her the smaller package. "This one's for you." Curious, Elena opened it and froze. Inside was a framed photograph she had never seen before. Nathan, young and sun-tanned, sitting on a dock, a guitar resting across his knees. His smile was effortless, his face full of something lost, and now found again. "I didn't know you had this," she whispered. "It was taken the last summer we spent together as a family," Edward said. "Before..." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Before the silence. Before the pride. Before the years that stretched between them like a canyon neither knew how to cross. "Thank you," Elena said quietly. Not just for the photo, but for what it meant and what it mended. Edward nodded. "There's one more thing." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a document. "I've set up education funds for the girls, nothing extravagant, but enough to give them options. Freedom." A year ago, Elena might have refused, might have seen it as guilt wrapped in generosity. But now she saw it for what it was. Not control, not obligation. Love. "Connor would be grateful," she said, "and so am I." From inside came a shriek of laughter followed by the unmistakable sound of two small girls chasing each other around the living room. Edward's face softened a smile, touching his features, not practiced or polite, but real. "I never imagined this," he murmured, and neither had she. But here they were, not perfect, not finished, but together. "I never thought I'd have this again," Edward said quietly, his voice carrying more weight than volume. "A second chance at family." Elena rested her hand lightly on his arm. Her voice was soft but sure. "Sometimes the greatest gifts life gives us come from the places we're most broken." They stood like that for a moment, two people forever changed by grief, by time, and by each other, before stepping back inside, where streamers dangled precariously and balloons squeaked under tiny fingers. Edward bent down to help Hazel with a balloon knot, his once immaculate shirt now wrinkled a streak of icing somehow on his sleeve. Elena watched him really, and saw not the man she once resented, but someone entirely new, not just Nathan's father, not just her former landlord, but a pillar, a steady, flawed learning presence, a grandfather, a friend, a man who had shown up when it mattered most and kept showing up. In that room filled with half-hung decorations and the chatter of two almost 7-year-olds, Elena felt it. They had come full circle from strangers tied by loss to a family bound by love. The journey hadn't started in joy. It had begun with a slammed door, an eviction notice, and years of silence. But it had led them here to healing, to connection, to something that felt like home. None of them could have predicted this moment. Not Edward hunched over a string of tangled streamers. Not Elena once terrified of losing everything. Not even the twins who now laughed without hesitation and planned next Sunday's adventure before this one had even ended. And somewhere in the quiet that lives just beyond laughter, Elena felt it. Nathan would be proud of the girls of the man his father was becoming. As Edward lifted Lily so she could tape a streamer to the top of the wall, his designer suit forgotten his balance shaky but determined, Elena smiled. There, in the chaos of balloons and birthday wishes, surrounded by the pieces of something they had built together, she knew they were not perfect, but they were whole. Some stories don't begin with joy. They begin with loss, with silence, with pain, too heavy to name. But in the quiet rebuilding, in small moments of courage, in showing up when it matters most, love finds its way back in. This was never just a story about a man finding his grandchildren. It was about a family rediscovering what it means to belong, and perhaps the most beautiful kind of family is the one that chooses each other day by day, moment by moment. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to Shining Stories, where every story is a reminder that even in brokenness, something beautiful can grow. Until next time, keep listening, keep feeling, keep shining.